Do you remember Nina Jankowicz? If you care about censorship from the government, you probably are very familiar with that name. Jankowicz, of course, was named back in 2022 as the head of a new disinformation governance board that Joe Biden's Department of Homeland Security created. That ended up being scrapped, and Jankowicz ended up really becoming the face of what was seen as this ideological movement to broaden the definition of what type of speech should be subject to suppression in this era of social media. Now, why are we talking about Nina Jankowicz again? She is now the CEO of something called the American Sunlight Project, which seems to be an effort to advance that ideological approach to how social media companies should suppress or view speech that is a threat to national security, for example, or disinformation. Well, the House Foreign Affairs Committee is holding a hearing today on the censorship industrial complex. This is from the House Committee on Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on South and Central Asia, and the title of this hearing is called Censorship Industrial Complex, The Need for First Amendment Safeguards at the State Department. The chairman of that committee is Bill Huizenga, and the ranking member is Sydney Kamlager-Dove, who is a representative from Los Angeles, a Democrat representative from Los Angeles, took over Karen Bass's seat. Karen Bass is now the mayor of Los Angeles. Just so you know a little bit about where Nina Jankowicz, who's somebody, if you follow these issues from the left or the right, and particularly, I mean the left, like the Matt Taibbi left. By the way, Taibbi is testifying for this subcommittee. You will remember Nina Jankowicz, and you will see her as somebody who is the unfortunate face of this ideological movement, unfortunate but sort of perfect representation of this ideological movement to look more broadly, to sort of open the aperture on what type of speech should be subject to downranking or suppression or disinformation governance, to use the title of that board. So the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Republicans on the committee, put out a video. By the way, I heard from some sources involved with the committee that Republicans were surprised that Democrats called Jankowicz to testify. I think they did it over the weekend. Republicans seem to have been kind of caught off guard based on my reporting. It's such a brazen rejection of what voters rejected last November. If you don't think that what J.D. Vance and Donald Trump were talking about on the campaign trail when it came to the sort of nanny state approach to speech made a difference when they were going on Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn and Andrew Schultz, or what those guys were talking about when they were looking at the Biden administration's record. If you don't think that made a difference, you are wrong. So in some sense, this is Democrats doubling down on failed and rejected policies, dangerous policies, not just morally wrong, but politically toxic policies. So you can understand why Republicans would be sort of surprised to see Jankowicz's name come up and be called as a witness in this hearing. But let's take a look at a video that the Republicans on the Foreign Affairs Committee re-upped of Nina Jankowicz that became sort of let's say, a big part of the conversation back when she was initially named the head of this DHS disinformation board. We can roll this.
Laundering is really quite ferocious. It's when a huckster takes some lies and makes them sound precocious by saying them in Congress or a mainstream outlet. So disinformation's origins are slightly less atrocious. It's how you hide a little lie. It's how you hide a little lie. It's how you hide a little lie. When Rudy Giuliani shared bad intel from Ukraine, or when TikTok influencers say COVID can cause pain. They're laundering disinfo and we really should take note and not support their lies with our wallet, voice or vote. Oh, information laundering is really quite ferocious. It's when a huckster takes some lies and makes them sound precocious by saying them in Congress or a mainstream outlet. So disinformation's origin seems slightly less atrocious.
It hurts to look back on that clip. It is so painful. It is brutal. It feels like this relic of a time gone by. People talk a lot about the vibe shift. There are partisan implications. Actually, I say people. I talk a lot about the vibe shift because I think it's pretty clear that something changed in politics and culture after the November election. When you have CEOs approaching this differently, you have major corporations, not just kind of lining up behind Trump, but also like Mark Zuckerberg and X, obviously, changing their speech policies, Republicans embracing TikTok. All of this is happening in a way it's changing our politics and our culture, and it's a response to, I think, corporate America, even with what they've done to walk back from DEI in some cases, recognizing that the forces they were responding to over the course of the pandemic and a little bit earlier, so Me Too movement, cancel culture, were not representative of the broader American public. The broader American public rejects this ideology, rejects the girl boss, nanny state, censorship, or suppression, the ideology behind that. And here we are. Now, Nina and Democrats are calling Nina Jankowicz to rebut the testimony of, in this case, Matt Taibbi, who has been absolutely excellent on this issue. By the way, a man of the left who has never been a friend politically or ideologically, I should say, to the right, though he is, like many old school leftists, happy to be friendly with the right. He's come on the show several times, one of my very favorite guests. And Ben Weingarten, another friend of mine who is also testifying. And I actually asked Ben, by the way, if he had anything he wanted me to add in this video before we went to air. And he said, the minority chose as one witness a legal scholar who has savaged the First Amendment, casting it as a tool of racism and bigotry. He said the minority chose as a witness a stalwart of the, quote, counter-disinformation space, previously tabbed to run what was poised to serve as America's preeminent ministry of truth in the mercifully ill-fated Disinformation Governance Board. Ben says that Democrats chose these individuals as witnesses speaks volumes about their continued devotion to policing speech. Their continued devotion to policing speech. And it's hard to argue with Ben, given that, again, they chose Jankowicz. He says it suggests that should they return to power, the U.S. wing of the censorship industrial complex will come back with a vengeance, and that's why Republicans must dismantle and destroy the censorship regime post-haste. Ben points me to Nina Jankowicz's testimony, which has already been published before the hearing, and this is her statement. I read the entire thing before we went to air, and it's incredible. It's incredible for how shameless it is, because Jankowicz sort of approaches head on. And in fact, you can see this post she put up on Blue Sky, which is sort of funny in and of itself, saying, I'm going to do battle against conspiracy theories. This is what she posted. Going to do battle with a conspiracy theory tomorrow. Would appreciate your support because the Republicans are expected to go after Jankowicz and her role in the Disinformation Governance Board. And that obviously already proved to be true because the House Foreign Affairs Committee and subcommittee has been preemptively pushing back on Jankowicz, given that, they see it as a huge tool in their political toolkit, because it makes Democrats look like, as Ben says, they're doubling down on the censorship regime. And Jankowicz reposted the video that the Foreign Affairs Committee posted on X. This feels like middle school to walk through. But she says, looks like the GOP is gearing up for a serious discussion. If you don't think it's serious to point out the video that you posted years ago, you made it, you posted it, you wrote the song about what you claimed was a serious issue of, quote, information laundering, is what that video was about. If you thought that was a serious way to approach the issue, you have absolutely no ground to stand on when you are criticizing Republicans for making it a serious issue. That's not a knock. You're not dunking on Republicans by calling them unserious for bringing back something, a serious issue that you treated with abject unseriousness and turned into a Mary Poppins song about information laundering that was essentially a fancy way to argue for deranking, downranking, suppressing speech. So what do we mean by all of this, by the way? Because Jankowicz in her testimony is leaning so hard in to what she did and is saying efforts to frame it as censorship, efforts to frame what the Biden administration was doing as censorship or suppression, to label it as a censorship industrial complex, are in themselves a conspiracy. And that means those people are conspiracy theorists. And this is just a smear, plain and simple, that is used for her to lean into it. It's not like actually an entirely bad tactic because it makes her look like she's owning the argument and not shirking from it or walking away from anything. And that's what her testimony is doing. She is owning this completely, just saying that it's not actually censorship. It's not actually suppression. It doesn't actually have anything to do with the government coordinating. All of her opponents are wrong. And she is just innocently trying to protect the American people from disinformation. So let's go back to what was actually going on here. Ben, this is from Ben's statement, which I also read ahead of it. It's published to the government's website. He says, as the Daily Wire and the Federalist summarized, by the way, I worked at the Federalist in disclosure during the time period in question here, in their lawsuit against the State Department concerning, in part, the Global Engagement Center's support of NewsGuard and GDI, that's the Global Disinformation Index, the risk raters' efforts not only reduce their revenue, but their visibility on social media and ranking results from browser searches, thereby reducing their circulation, readership, and reach, and otherwise negatively impacting their operations. Unheard has been caught up in the censorship industrial complex as well, which just goes to prove how ridiculous this entire thing is. It's about speech that the left finds dangerous, that the establishment, I should say, finds dangerous. It's not necessarily about right or left or Republican or Democrat. It's about speech that overwhelmingly ends up being right of center or critical of the left, even if it's from the left, including like Matt Taibbi, people like Matt Taibbi. If it is deemed dangerous, then it is basically, can be categorized as something that is worth suppressing, or is not even just worth suppressing, but is necessarily suppressed. So what Ben's talking about there, this was reported on by Taibbi and Gabe Kaminsky at the Washington Examiner. He's now at the Free Press. The Global Engagement Center was part of the State Department, funded by the government. So the Global Engagement Center was in turn, try to follow this like I'm Charlie Day on It's Always Sunny creating the chart, but it's actually not a conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy. The Global Engagement Center supported NewsGuard and the Global Disinformation Index. NewsGuard and the Global Disinformation Index, in turn, were then rating the alleged quality of reporting that was put out by different news outlets, and overwhelmingly targeting information that was deemed dangerous. This actually swept up some people from the left as well, and sometimes this information was completely vindicated information about COVID, for example. This is how Josh Hawley, when Nina Jankowicz was named the head of the governance board, Josh Hawley, we can put this up on the screen, pointed out that Jankowicz at the time has said the new DHS board will, quote, maintain the department's commitment to protecting free speech. Hawley says this is particularly ironic given Jankowicz's extensive criticism of free speech and the First Amendment. Jankowicz has claimed, quote, the free speech versus censorship framing is a false dichotomy. And when Elon Musk, Hawley says, announced his acquisition of Twitter, Jankowicz said, quote, I shudder to think about if free speech absolutists were taking over more platforms, what that would look like for the marginalized communities which are already shouldering disproportionate amounts of this abuse. Hawley continues, Jankowicz has even described opponents of social media speech codes as, quote, First Amendment zealots. These statements that question the value of free speech are obviously disqualifying for such a role. So whatever Nina Jankowicz says today and whatever Democrats applaud and platform, to borrow a left word, applaud and platform Nina Jankowicz for saying today, this is exactly, to Ben's point, doubling down on the anti-speech idea that because social media allows people to freely express themselves, there need to be serious safeguards that they plan to politicize in order to protect Americans from speech that could harm national security, or, to borrow Jankowicz's formulation here, even if she won't own it anymore, the marginalized communities who are targeted by, quote, the free speech absolutists like Elon Musk, who are taking over platforms. Now, I would quibble with the idea that Elon Musk is a free speech absolutist, but it's also worth noting that Jankowicz lost a libel suit against Fox News back in 2024. She sued them over their coverage of the disinformation governance board. And it is, pretty hilarious for somebody who has this anti-speech record to then also be suing a news outlet. That lawsuit was tossed out. So suing a news outlet on very dubious grounds in a way that would chill speech of a journalistic institution, whether you like it or not, journalists doing their job over at Fox News. So it is what Ben said, completely true, that this is, if you're somebody who wants, if you look at, for example, here's my quibble with Elon Musk being called a free speech absolutist. X, obviously, he's no longer in charge of X, but X just the other week agreed to censor dissidents in Turkey at the behest of the Turkish government. Elon Musk has done that before with other governments. X put out a statement last week saying it didn't agree, it didn't want to do that, but an argument that Elon Musk has made before is it's either you do that or there's no X in that country, which is a perfectly fine argument. It's pretty hard to defend as a free speech absolutist, but it's, I suppose it's defensible. And if you're somebody who looks at what's happening to students, as Jankowicz points out in her testimony, by the way, like the Tufts students, Ozturk, she says the topic of this hearing, Jankowicz, is the need for First Amendment safeguards at the State Department. The Secretary of State seemingly revoked Miss Ozturk's visa for publishing an op-ed in Tufts campus newspaper. And if you're somebody who looks at what just happened, via the Secretary of State to Ozturk, a student at Tufts University, that has so far been predicated on an op-ed criticizing Israel that Ozturk wrote. That is the justification for yanking the visa. To defend that from a free speech point of view is really not something the Trump administration, look, from my perspective, as somebody on the right, has done convincingly so far. So if you're somebody on the left who's concerned about that, you should be terrified that Democrats are now pulling Nina Jankowicz in to defend the left's perspective on speech moderation and speech suppression, because Jankowicz doesn't have a leg to stand on when she criticizes the Secretary of State for doing that, because she herself has made, as Marco Rubio is making in this case, a national security argument in favor of censorship, in favor of suppression. And we can quibble over what's censorship and what's suppression, but suppression is a charitable way to put what Jankowicz has advanced. I just read her own words here. This is not somebody who's a free speech absolutist by her own description, and Democrats actually should have people like Matt Taibbi. Matt Taibbi should have been the witness that Democrats called to the stand in this case, because he's somebody who's been perfectly consistent across the board on these things. Instead, they're pulling in Nina Jankowicz, which is just going to allow the Trump administration to get away over and over again with doing what it's doing to students, which I don't agree with. We talked here with Greg Lukianoff last week, someone from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Greg is the head of it, and he has been consistent on this basically across the board. And even if I disagree with Greg on a couple of things, this is what gives the Trump administration, it gives the right the ability. The right, I'm disappointed as somebody on the right to see what's happened with these student visas, to be honest. And what gives the right the ability to do that is the left continuing to forfeit the moral high ground over and over and over again, because it becomes a doom spiral. And so it's a bad sign. It's not a surprising one, but it's a bad sign that the left is not course correcting on this, because that's what's badly needed in order to actually have a consensus position on what's fair and what's not fair in the age of social media, where it's different than people, having a conversation at a bar. You can't have the government search every word immediately that is being uttered in a bar, and just as someone is saying it, 10 seconds later, it's gone. It disappears as though it was never said, and it's, nobody can ever hear it again. It's erased from any recordings, which wouldn't be made, obviously, in a bar, but, they can't censor that. With social media, the government can. The government can tell X to have its moderators suppress or censor speech by its algorithm or whatever it is. And that's a dangerous time to have both parties using these dubious national security excuses, and to have people, whether it's Nina Jankowicz or some of the witnesses that the right has called on anti-Semitism, which will be defined by some of those witnesses just purely as anti-Zionism or criticism of Israel. It is a bad time for that to be both parties' consensus definition of suppression-worthy speech, to put it that way. And it's insane in Jankowicz's testimony, she plans to say one of the witnesses at today's hearing, blogger Matt Taibbi, which is always intentionally rude way to refer to a journalist, was among those who published the first installment of the Twitter files, falsely alleging that Twitter executives were colluding with government to censor disfavored content. Falsely alleging? I mean, Twitter executives were regularly meeting with people in the intelligence community, and yeah, it's impossible to prove that they definitively did X because of Y or A because of B, but the word colluding is pretty. There's no other reason that they had these back channels to communicate with each other, if not to influence the way that those, quote, Twitter executives were seeing this question of speech. Mark Zuckerberg said the FBI briefed Facebook, Meta, before the Hunter Biden laptop story dropped. By the way, we know the FBI had the laptop before it was doing this briefing to say, hey, we expect Russian disinformation to come out. And then you had all these former Intel guys saying, this laptop has all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation, and then Facebook at the time used that as an excuse to suppress it. So if you don't consider that collusion, then maybe in the narrowest legal sense, sure. But if that doesn't concern you, you don't deserve to have a platform by either party as some type of expert witness on free speech who has the moral authority to defend this essential principle of the American Republic. It's just stupid. So great news all around today. I think we're making real progress on free speech in America in the age of social media. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, and you can go over to undercurrents.tv to get a premium experience of the show. You can join our community over there. You get a weekly email from me. You get an email address where you can get in touch with us directly, and you also get premium episodes of the show just for paying subscribers. So make sure to tune in over there, and we'll be back with more Undercurrents soon.